get things kicked off today with our program. So again, my name is Alec Cooley, and I'm a senior advisor here with Busch Systems, and I'll be helping to get things kicked off this morning with our program, which is entitled Implementing BIN Infrastructure Standards. We're excited to do this program. That this is going to be a partnership between Busch Systems and the Zero Waste Campus Council. And for those of you not familiar with the council, they are a group of professionals working in the recycling and zero waste sustainable materials management field, who get together for networking events and other events to support and help build professional knowledge. We'll hear a little bit more about the council toward the end of the program and some of the other programs that they do on their own, but we welcome them and the opportunity to collaborate on this program together today. So, set the agenda. This is going to be a hybrid program. We're going to combine a presentation at the beginning from Anya Dale with the University of Michigan in just a moment, hearing a little bit more about what they're doing at the University of Michigan, how they've implemented BIN standards, what that process looks like, how their program is set up. That'll be to help to sort of set the stage for what we then hope will be a good, active discussion amongst all of us together. When Anya's done, we're going to break up into separate Zoom rooms, and we're going to have 3 different topic areas. I'm going to stay here in the main room with Anya. For those who are interested to have specific questions or learn a little bit more about what Michigan is doing, go ahead and stay in the main room. And then we'll also use this as an area for just general discussion of a broad range of topics, whatever areas of interest that folks have that are not covered in the other 2 rooms, which will be in room 2, we'll have Julie Meir from Stanford, who's also Stanford University and who's with the Zero Waste Campus Council. Julie will be facilitating the discussion, focusing on how we implement standards. What is sort of the administrative process with the stakeholders involved with getting standards put into place at your facility. And then in room 3, we'll talk about more, once you have those standards implemented, how do you actually institutionalize them? How do you enforce to make sure that across the whole institution they are broadly followed and put in place? So we'll talk a little bit more about what we'll be discussing in these separate rooms in a few minutes, but just want to set that stage. Then at the end of the hour, we're going to pivot. And for those who are interested, we're going to end the official program on this implementing BIN standards focus. But then for those who are interested to stay on, we at Busch Systems would like to get input from you. We're looking on how we can improve bins, develop new bin products. And we have some questions we would love to get your input on around indoor organics bins, as well as bins for collecting liquid from the people are pouring out. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about this toward the end, but we hope that folks will be interested to stay on with us. And without further ado, let's go ahead and just jump right into it. So I'm going to bring up Anya here on stage. I'll just point out that we are doing it, with this format. It's more of a meetings format than a traditional webinar. We can see everybody's tiles are all up on the screen. And we do ask that you keep yourself muted throughout the program, but then later when we go into the breakout rooms, you'll have the ability to raise your hand and actually speak and engage directly. And of course, we always encourage folks to use the chat, just share ideas, riff off of anything you're hearing others say. There's that participation. And with that, let me hand it over to Anya Dale with the University of Michigan.
Yeah, thank you. So hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about lately. So I'm glad that there'll be some discussion around it. I'm going to share some of the experiences that the University of Michigan has had in our waste bin standardization efforts, and some of the things that we've learned along the way, and some of the things that we're continuing to do to maintain those standards, because once they're in place, that's not necessarily a job done. So I'll share some of those things, and looking forward to some of the questions and conversation that we have afterwards. All right, next slide. Thanks. All right, so one of the things that we started off with, so this might be a sort of a familiar view for a lot of folks, is we anecdotally knew that we had many, many different styles of bins out there, not a lot of consistency in where they were placed, lots of different signage. So, there are things that you could sort of see that it evolved over time, or different buildings or units wanted to take education into their own hands sometimes, or purchasing the bins into their own hands. But this is just a quick glimpse into many of the different designs and signage that we had, scattered throughout our couple hundred buildings. So something we were all aware of, but in order to figure out how to take action on it, we needed to have something a little bit more solid than just that anecdotal, evidence from conversation. So in the next slide, we can go on to some of the things that we had to do to make the case. So in order to get, in our case, funding to move forward with trying to implement bin standards, we started with data gathering. So we had to put some metrics actually behind all this anecdotal stuff, claiming that we needed more standardization, and that showing that this will actually help us towards our waste reduction goal. So for the University of Michigan, we had set a goal to reduce the waste that was going to landfill by 40%. So, so for us, tying it to like the actual bin standards to showing that it makes an impact on that goal was going to be important. So one of the things that we did was first to do a comparative waste sort. So we did waste sorts of one building that had really fantastic or comparatively fantastic signage, and one that really didn't have any consistent signage about what goes where, and basically compare what we found from the sort. So, how much waste actually was being diverted, and then how contaminated were the recycling. In that case, at that point, we only had recycling. How contaminated was the recycling stream? And so, not surprisingly, signage matters. So it was easy to see that if you had consistent signage, there was an increased diversion rate, more usage of the recycling bins and more proper use, so less contamination. So we had that data now to file away. And then we did a 30 building waste bin audit. So we picked 30 buildings that we thought were fairly representative of what we had on campus, and then walked those buildings with the facility managers, and then followed up with facility manager interviews. And so we actually made note on building floor plans that showed where there were different kinds of bins. We developed a lot of shorthand to indicate what type of bin was there, whether they were paired or not, was there single stream labels or lids on those bins, was there any signage or posters either near the bin, on the bin, that sort of thing. And then talk to the facility managers about if they didn't have signage, why. And we ended up getting a lot of information back. A lot of folks said that the number one thing that they felt that paper signage on the bin or on the wall behind the bin was just visual clutter. They didn't want to do it. Or that maybe it would get stuck behind the bin, but then the bin moves. So now the poster is kind of irrelevant because it's not paired with the actual bin. So things like that. So we started to uncover what some of the barriers were to having consistent bins and signage in the buildings. And then at the same time, we were starting to get a much more detailed inventory of what these buildings look like and how many different versions we have everywhere. Next slide. So after we had these two different studies, some information to show that it really is an issue, what have been some of the barriers, what could the potential positive impact be, a presidential committee was put together. And that committee formed draft recommendations for how we can improve our waste diversion. And one of the top resulting recommendations was that we needed to develop bin standards and design standards for our signage, along with placement standards. So all of those together. And what we had learned from the waste sorts and the walkthroughs and the interviews with the facility managers really did align well with what we also found on that committee to be sort of the industry best practices. Having centralized bins benefit both the users and the building custodial staff. We opted to pull the bins out of classrooms and conference rooms in favor of having fewer bins in more centralized locations in the hallways, for example. Bins were often being separated by people. So, hopefully we all know that having bins paired means that people have the choice of putting them in the right location or the materials into the right bin. but bins are being just separated. You know, so maybe somebody's doing an office clean out, so they drag the recycling bin into their office and it doesn't make its way back to where it started. So things were getting separated in that way. So we ended up finding strategies to keep them actually physically connected to each other. Let's see, we also had to work with our fire marshal to make sure that with the new bin placements that it was actually adhering to all of the codes and standards. So with this is just a very high overview, but these are some of the things that were the recommendations that came from that committee. You can see that we had consistent colors now associated with different waste streams, the restrictive lids, and a lot of research went into how we were going to represent the different items on the actual signage, including we had a couple of people who were behavioral scientists and psychologists on our committee too. I see a question, how is brown decided for compost? Because we are U of M and the idea of having it be green was not acceptable because there's apparently some sort of a competition with Michigan State. There's a lot of back and forth between brown and green for that reason. So that's what we came to. Yeah. All right, next slide. So trying to implement the bin standards after the fact, you know, retrofitting areas is pretty difficult. So we're trying to make sure that these standards, I should back up a little bit. So we had it took us about 3 years to go through every building and completely update these standards. And I'm not getting into the logistics of that here, but that's something we can talk about afterwards if folks have questions of how we actually handled all that coordination. It was a huge collaboration with custodial services and our moving and trucking folks and facility managers. But something that we found is, you know, it's not done just because you got all of those buildings turned around. And especially trying to implement these bin standards after the fact, right? There's already other bins in these buildings is a lot more difficult than getting the sort of right bins in place when it's a new building. So we established a process for having proper bin placement figured out and considered at the front end of any new building project or renovation that's happening on campus. We have a team that's called the Architecture, Engineering, and Construction team that designs the buildings and oversees the project. They bring us in as they are finalizing floor plans now. So that gives us a chance to catch it if their designer has maybe, you know, designed a place for fancy bins where they want to pick something different. You know, maybe they decide that they want bins made out of marble, who knows? Crazy stuff happens, or that they want to do like built-in, you know, where it's like a cutout on the counter. You know, sometimes the designers have ideas for what they think it should look like, but it doesn't meet our standards and often ends up meaning more contamination in those bins. So we're involved before all of those things are finalized with the actual floor plans now. We have a really close relationship with our facility managers and custodial services staff. So we offer to do building walkthroughs with them if the bins are starting to get a little bit unruly, or if you know they just sort of want to reevaluate if things make sense for the space. And we also have now a really great web page that is specific to bin standards. And this is just one of the examples of the resources that's on it. Because when people reach out to us and say, hey, we need X number of bins and signs or lids or whatever, not everybody's using the same lingo. So this actually is just like this is just a picture, and like these are the different parts that people can refer to. So you can see, like, you can't really see it too easily, but number 5 is the connector. That's something that physically holds the recycling and landfill bin together so they can't be separated. Who is we when we walk the building? Facility managers, the Office of Campus Sustainability. Yeah, we have somebody on staff, I'll get to that in a little bit, that's sort of focused on this project. And the sign holders, we also from Busch Systems. I probably missed some of those questions. So having things like this on our webpage is really helpful. We also have on the same webpage the full complete bin standards. We have a flow chart that I'll show you on the next slide that highlights some of the things, a bunch of quick reference and cheat sheets that are helpful for building staff and custodial staff who might be wanting to request new bins, as well as a Google form, so that if someone is requesting it, that now comes to us, and we check to make sure that it follows the standards before before that request is getting fulfilled. So people can't circumvent us and just go buy their own bin somewhere. They have to go through us, and we check off to make sure that it follows our standards. Thanks for sticking that link into the chat. So because a lot of people might not be interested in actually reading all the way through our bin standards through the document that is available online, we do try to have some sort of like easier reference documents like this flow chart. It just sort of gives a high level of what goes where. For example, we don't place bins anymore in classrooms or auditoriums or conference rooms. Recycling bins aren't placed in labs for safety reasons. They're placed just outside the lab, that sort of thing. And then you can notice in some areas where it talks about, compost bins might be appropriate in these areas, but need approval from the Office of Campus Sustainability so that they do not start putting compost bins where we haven't had a chance to do, like what we call a where to throw training, or make sure that they're only using reusables or compostables in that space. It also clarifies the costs. So for us, the general fund of buildings, the funding for this comes from the general fund. So general fund buildings, as long as it's meeting the standards, they get the bins as needed. But if somebody wants to go above and beyond, and for example, we have two different types of bins. We have the sort of the basic bin that you saw on the previous slide, or a couple slides ago, previous slide. But we also have designer bins that are fancier, metal, bigger, notably more expensive. In our standards, those only go in sort of main atrium areas. We're not just putting those everywhere. And so if there's a unit that does want to start putting those in some of the office suites because they think that it's justified there, that's okay. But now that is going to be a customer pay for them to pay that cost difference, because we have 300 buildings, and that would get pretty crazy if we started going above and beyond the standard in all these places where people might want it. All right, next. So location matters a lot. So as we've been placing these, especially when we start looking at compost placements, we found that it's really, really important to balance accessibility with the need for being very intentional in our placement and kind of controlling the environment. So, the more publicly facing these bins are, the more contamination that we tend to have. I think that people just sort of, might be people who are just transitioning through a space, maybe in a hurry. They're not sort of sitting and maybe spending more time looking at the signs. And we've done a lot of we do visual audits, ongoing visual audits, and representative waste audits in-house that just sort of continually verify that that's the case. So we want to place recycle bins and compost bins where people can use them so that we can try to divert as much waste as we can, while also keeping in mind the issues of contamination, which is pretty real. So in our case, our visual audits and the waste sorts are showing us that those entryways, atriums, and outdoor bins tend to have the highest contamination rate. Comparatively, staff kitchens, lounges, offices, areas that are like used by the same people every day tend to be pretty low in contamination. It's also helped us to figure out what are the most commonly misplaced items. So like on our campus, everybody seems to think that coffee cups should be recyclable. So that helps us tailor some of our communication and our what we consider supplemental signage. So you can see that there are signs directly on the bins that is very tightly regulated. But if there are particular areas that have different potential waste and contamination, I think I'll get into that a little bit, we can have some additional supplemental signage that targets those things based on some of the information we find in these waste audits. Next slide. So that kind of leads into what are some of the challenges of these really public areas. So again, we have standards for bins, standards for signage. Some of these areas before we had those bin standards already had these cutouts in place, and they're not going to pull all of those normal countertops out and stop using them. So we've had to have some flexibility. They continue to be kind of challenging spots, to be honest. So again, this goes back to any time a place is renovated or like a newly designed spot, making sure that we're in there talking to the designers about our bin standards. You can see in the bottom to the left two pictures that there's examples of those waste bins that are cut out into the countertop. We even tried to put a little, people say it looks like a toilet seat, a little lid on them to see if we can slow people down and think twice before they put stuff into those compost bins, because those are the spots that are most contaminated on campus, especially because they're in cafes. So these areas that have less control of the material, like, we might not have as many. Okay, so in staff kitchens, we have 750 staff kitchens and kitchenette areas that are composting. In those cases, we can work with the staff to make sure that they're purchasing only reusable or compostable ware. And in that case, we can have an open lid. I think maybe we'll see another picture soon, or I can scroll back if we need to. An open lid where it's not really restrictive. We can trust that they know what goes into the compost bin. But if we have compost in a more public space, like in a hallway, atrium, cafe, we have found we really need a lid because we don't have as much control over what those items in the packaging are in those spaces. So that's one of the ways that we need to be more flexible and start doing some more of the supplemental signage. So we might have something that says, if we're noticing a lot of the contamination is Starbucks coffee cups, we might specifically call that out on a sign that is separate from the bin signs, up in the corner, and call that out. Yeah. All right, we can move on to the next slide. And as we're trying to make compost or other things just more accessible, so I mentioned again that we started rolling some of these things out in the staff areas that are a little bit more easily controlled. But again, we're trying to make it also very accessible and have students and other people have the ability to use these waste bins. So we're trying to sort of get around those tricky locations that tend to have more contamination by doing things like we have an adopt a compost bin pilot program where staff groups or students can essentially nominate a location for a compost bin. And then for a month, they keep an eye on it. They look in it and let us know if they're noticing any contamination. And if so, what kind. So we can do some follow-up education there or signage. It's working pretty well. We have been doing a lot of focus groups on trying to balance accessibility of these bins with issues of contamination. We hear a lot of information, especially from students, that knowing why composting is important or recycling is important is key, right? Just saying like, recycle this, compost this. I think that they, like, especially if you can attach some of that supplemental messaging or education to carbon emissions, for example, makes a big difference. All right, next. And then I mentioned that, we're trying to make sure that these standards are maintained. We are really lucky, and I highly suggest people consider having, this is Nancy. She is the star of our office. She's a half-time employee, and she manages the bin program. And honestly, I don't know that we would be able to keep up with the bin standards without having somebody who's dedicated to it. Because, even the best bins might break because they're getting heavily used by students. That can be kind of rough. Things still get moved around, or the use of the building changes as just the functions within the space change. So we pretty regularly do walkthroughs with the building facility managers or custodial teams to adjust the standards, not adjust the standards, but adjust how those standards are applying to individual buildings on a pretty regular basis. Again, meeting with those the building designers and architects so that we can make sure that new spaces are meeting the standards. As there are requests for new bins, it's really nice that those bin requests are getting funneled through Nancy. and she can verify that they are going to meet the standards before those bins are then released and placed into the building. Because otherwise, there's a lot of ways that people could get around that beforehand and end up sort of undermining our efforts for standardization. So this has really, really been key, and I would suggest that people plan that into their budget and their programs of having somebody dedicated to trying to keep this up. We also have the actual insert signs, the paper that you would put into the sign holders. We have those printable online because you wouldn't believe, things just get worn over time. How many messages we get about people wanting to come out there and replace those because they've gotten dingy or somebody spilled on something or they've fallen out. And that way people can take it upon themselves to replace if they can. And we provide the plastic film that goes in along with those inserts. We provide those to all of the facility managers and custodial supervisors in different buildings so that they can take some ownership over doing that as well. So that goes back to the importance of that partnership. Next. And then I mentioned that we're continuing to sort of fine tune these things based on data that we get together. So last year we spent a lot of the year trying to beef up our evaluation efforts, specifically of our compost program, but also recycling to see where we can improve our diversion rates, reduce contamination, communicate better across the campus. We did 3 waste sorts with representative sample polls, working with the custodial team. We use some sort of these ongoing visual bin audits where we literally just sort of walk in and peek into bins and make note of contamination and what space we're looking at. Is this a hallway, a staff kitchen, a lounge area, a student study space? And that's how we are able to pick out what type of contamination is popping up where, and helps us with our signage. And it also helps us figure out where it's appropriate to place certain bins or not. I see a question about what does a representative sample look like for us? We might decide that we're going to pull 20% of the bins from a building, the liners from the building. And so we would walk with the custodial staff that morning, and we have labels that we would stick onto the bag that says hallway or office space or kitchenette, so that we know when we're pulling what type of space that came from within the building. And we also compare differently, like lab buildings versus res halls versus classroom buildings, because people behave differently in those. So all of this stuff together sort of helps us figure out what are the trends that are happening. And then that helps us to inform, is our bin placement and the signage and all of that, is it working, or how can it be tweaked? So that's helped us as we continue to expand, for example, our compost program. Next slide. And then we've also been continuing to utilize feedback mechanisms besides just our own sort of visual audits. We found that going out to our compost site once a week, we literally just look to see what got pulled from the campus, and it goes down to a third-party site off of campus. But we just take a look and see what are the contaminations looking like, and sometimes we can figure out what contamination is coming from where. But the more specific we can get that information, the better. So luckily, it's our waste management services team who picks up our compost at the dock and recycling at the dock. And sometimes they'll say, hey, the stuff at this building was kind of a mess today. And that helps us to figure out, well, what happened at that building that day? Maybe there was a big event and they were hosting a lot of people from out of town that maybe don't know our waste system or something. But it helps us to sort of be able to circle back and figure out how can we tweak our signage or different bin placements to reduce contamination. And we also have really cool boots on the ground green team members who this image to the right is a sticky note that we can provide to people who have gone through a training that knows what properly goes into which bin. And they can provide little feedback notes that they stick on the bin and say, hey, your recycling is looking great. Or it would look great if you remembered you're not supposed to put plastic bags in there. And that allows people to get sort of immediate feedback to their colleagues about what goes where. And we've noticed that when those are in place, contamination goes down. And one more slide, I think. So, and then of course, I'll just say that infrastructure alone is not enough. You still need sort of other and ongoing support, supporting education and awareness efforts. So all of these feedback mechanisms we have help us to make sure that our bin placement standards and signage and lids and all of those things are doing what we intend for them to do. But we also want to make sure that we can take that information and use that to help inform our educational materials, piloting bins and new placements, and that sort of thing, so we can continually improve our programs. So we do have like a Where to Throw website and search tool online. I can pop this stuff into the chat after I'm done. We have like a video and recorded training of what goes where, and we provide these Where to Throw trainings live. We also have these cool QR codes, stickers that we put on bins that you can just do a QR code and it takes you to our quick video of what goes where. If people have a minute to stand there at the bin and figure out what might belong there. So we found that sort of all of that collectively is helpful, and we love our bins and we love our bin standardization, and it's a continual thing to make sure that it's being used properly, and that we can tweak things as we might need to. And I believe that was all I have, but I'm very eager to hear everybody's thoughts and questions.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Anya.